Good evening, everybody. The Music Fan is back, bringing smiles to the faces, knowledge to the people, and most importantly, music to the masses. And after a long hiatus, I am finally back with a brand new edition of Digging Through Discographies. Now, I'm really excited for the foreseeable future of this particular series. As I've already said, I'm going to be listening to a lot of albums of 2019, but I'm also going to be listening to albums that I missed over the last 10 years to get ready for my top 100 albums of the decade. And as you can imagine, that's going to be a lot of work. So to put a little less stress on my schedule, but also to give you great content nonetheless, I'm going to be going over a genre that I love very much and that I have a lot of expertise in over the years. That way, I can listen to these albums that I already know the back of my hand and give you a lot of good information while not having to put so much time and effort into listening to new albums. That particular genre is going to be grunge. It's a particular genre that I didn't grow up on because I was a little bit too young at the time, but got into it in my early teen years and have loved it ever since. I find it so fascinating that this particular era came and went so quickly with a little bit of time in the limelight, not just in mainstream rock, but also in mainstream music. I remember a lot of times during middle school and high school dances that Smells Like Teen Spirit was, still very popular in the early 2000s. And it baffles me that a band that, has roots in grunge, a particular genre that was kind of for misfits at points, got to the level that it did. And that's just one of these many bands that were part of this genre. And not just that, there are also other bands that after this genre kind of been influenced by this genre or were built out, from remnants of other bands. Case in point, Nirvana. Dave Grohl was the drummer at the time, and he became the frontman of Foo Fighters. So I'm going to try to not just go over the six main grunge bands to me, but I'm also going to go up subsects and talk about certain bands that were formed from that. I have a lot of information, I have a lot of stuff that I'm going to be doing over this year. I'm really excited. And of course, if you have other bands that fit in this genre that you would like me to review, let me know, because for me, the six main ones that I'm going to be doing are Stone Temple Pilots, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Bush, and Nirvana. But of course, there are other smaller ones that I didn't really listen to as much. So if you have any particulars that you want me to also include in this Digging Through Discographies, definitely let me know. It'll give me a lot more material. So the first one I'm going to be starting with is Stone Temple Pilots. And I believe that each one of these bands had its own unique thing that made it stand out in the grunge scene. And for me, there's three things that made this band stand out to me, even if it's not as popular as Nirvana. For me, it was Scott Weiland's voice. It's one of my vocal inspirations. Robert DeLeo as a bassist, fantastic. One of the most underrated bassists of all time. If you were looking for someone that not only gives you great rhythmic ideas and great improvisation, but also someone who can do a counter melody so beautifully, that is your guy. And third, this band went through so many different sound changes over the years that I think it's so interesting to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So, Stone Temple Pilots is a grunge/hard rock/alt rock band from San Diego, California. Their starting members were Scott Weiland on lead vocals, Dean DeLeo on guitar, Robert DeLeo on bass and backing vocals, and Eric Kretz on drums and percussion. Now, there are two conflicting stories on how frontman Scott Weiland and bassist Robert DeLeo met. The first one is they met at a Black Flag concert in Long Beach, California in 1985, and they began discussing their girlfriends only to realize that they were dating the same woman. However, instead of letting this come between them, they developed a bond and formed a band after they each subsequently broke it off with that girl. Now, Weiland presents a different version of the story in his autobiography, stating that Weiland and his friends, guitarist Corey Hickok and drummer David Allen, pursued Robert after witnessing him play live with him during sets at various gigs with their band Soul Descent. Either way, these four created this band. However, after a few years, Alan went his separate ways to pursue other interests. The remaining members witnessed drummer Eric Kretz play in a Long Beach club and convinced him to join the band. Corey Hickok eventually left the band in 1989 in need of a replacement, and auditioning many guitarists, Robert suggested his older brother, Dean. At the time, Dean was a successful businessman who had left behind his previous career as a musician but still played guitar as a hobby. The band managed to convince Dean to play guitar for Swing, completing the original STP lineup. Now yes, that is the case. This band was not actually called STP at the time, it was actually called Swing. But Dean refused to continue playing for a band called Swing, and shortly afterwards the band became Mighty Joe Young. The band recorded the demo tape, which was completed around 1990. The Mighty Joe Young demo tape features tracks that would go on to be re-recorded for the first studio album, as well as musical styles that would not be featured on any STP studio albums, such as funk and yodeling. Personally, I would think it would be really interesting to see how they would tackle those genres, but we'll never get to see. Mighty Joe Young played several gigs in San Diego to build up their fan base, one of their first ones being with Henry Rollins at the Whiskey A Go-Go. From there, they began to work on their debut album with Brendan O'Brien. Now you might be wondering, when did they finally become Stone Temple Pilots? And here is this point in time. They received a call from their lawyer who informed them that there was a bluesman who already claimed the name Mighty Joe Young, so they had to change it. So, inspired by STP motor oil stickers, the band members named themselves STP. Various ideas on the initials were shared with the band, including Stereo Temple Pirates and Shirley Temple's Pussy. They eventually settled, though, on a less crass name, which is Stone Temple Pilots, which they are known. So, a couple details on the actual disc itself. So the first recorded track for this album was the 96-second Wet My Bed, which emerged from an improv session between vocalist Scott Weiland and Robert DeLeo. So the funny thing is that this song is so weird that you actually hear Brendan O'Brien at the end of it go, "All right, now what?" Because what the heck did they just record on there? The idea of what they were trying to do with this particular album is they want to revive the more album-oriented music approach of the 1970s, and they want to create a cohesive album, hence the idea of core, being the core idea of the work rather than the single parts of it. The core also referring to the apple of biblical story, Adam and Eve. So talking about sin, which kind of permeates throughout this whole entire album, a lot of these ideas of that. In 1992, Stone Temple Pilots signed with Atlantic Records and then released Core, the album, through Atlantic Records in September 29th, 1992. The album had 4 singles: Sex Type Thing on January 25th, 1993, Plush on May 13th, 1993, Wicked Garden October 1st, 1993, and Creep on November 1st, 1993. Now, as you listen to this album, you are going to hear one clear thing at the get-go. This particular album is very heavy, is very sludgy, and it's very slow and intense. There's a lot of distorted guitar on this particular album. You might kind of sometimes actually mistake it for a slower, thrashy metal of the 80s. You could hear a lot of ideas of Metallica, ideas of Iron Maiden, of Megadeth, but a lot slower. And I think what makes it stand out in such an interesting way is the use of more bluesy chords and more colorful chords. So, for example, let me go over the idea of Plush. The idea of Plush, you have G to D to F to C to E flat major 7 to F. It's very colorful, and because of that, it gives this idea of what could have been a more distorted idea that's just a slower metal song into something that has a lot more character into it. And then from there you also get the idea in the pre-chorus, which is D, C, G, C. Or how about the actual chorus part? You go between E flat and F. different color ideas that stray away from the metal sounds of the 80s. Another idea on here is that song No Memory, which has a very interesting chord progression as well. It feels a little bit like a beginning of a Metallica ballad, but there's a difference in the sound. So it goes between A, C, then B minor, then G, then F, then B flat, then E minor. And the interesting one to me is that E minor, because it should go to an E major in there. But because of this completely different, interesting sound, which it blends all these different color ideas, it strays away from the metal sounds of the 80s into a more interesting and more vibrant idea. A lot of these songs are very much on that slower, distorted sound, and Scott Weiland on those songs is really growly in his voice. It kind of has these ideas of a James Hetfield at times, but Scott Weiland has a little bit more growl and sometimes a little bit more indecipherable with his lyrics. But to me, none of that really bothers me. Even though a lot of these songs do have this slower, distorted sound, I don't think any of them falter from sounding cookie cutter. In fact, to me, a lot of them have different things that make them interesting, whether it's the idea of a 6-measure long phrase in Dead and Bloated, or if it's Wicked Garden with its harmonies in the chorus, or the more thrash metal sound on there, or if it is Sin with its color changes, or Piece of Pie with its very interesting half-step progression in the bridge, or Plush with that chord progression that I talked about earlier. I think all of them, for the most part, does very well with its sound and gives it its own unique idea. I'll say the only one that kind of gets a little bit lackluster is Where the River Goes, the last one on the album, only because you've heard already 4 or 5 of these songs that sound very similar, and this one is 8 minutes long and doesn't really do much to change the tone of what has already been there. But I love Scott Weiland's voice on a lot of this stuff, and I love Robert DeLeo's playing on here. A lot of these songs, he uses more rhythmic ideas, but there are some stuff that he uses some counter melody ideas that makes for really, really interesting bass lines. I'll say that there are probably more memorable bass lines later in the discography, but I still love a lot of the stuff, whether it is on Dead and Bloated or Piece of Pie, where he goes absolute batshit crazy on a lot of these, or Plush that has a beautiful and very memorable bass line. To me, all their bass lines for the most part stand out one way or another and gives you another detail to listen to, while also Dean DeLeo playing a lot of really cool ideas as well. There are some different sounds on this album as well. Sex Type Thing and Cracker Man being more straightforward in their arrangements, not as much color differences, though Sex Type Thing in the bridge does have a little bit of interesting melody lines with Dean DeLeo on there. And what I love about the bass line for Robert DeLeo is it's more of a stopgap of just usually one note, as Dean DeLeo can play around with the ideas above it. These ones kind of break up the formula of the slower songs, which gives a much needed break. Though I'll say sometimes they're a little bit few and far between. Sex Type Thing is the second song on the album, and then Cracker Man is the second to last song on the album. Other than that, there's also Creep, which is the only real ballad on the album, and it's a beautiful one. It's a pretty much stripped down song compared to everything else, and it gives Scott Weiland a lot of room to make for, very poignant and beautiful lyrics, and the melody itself being absolutely incredible as well. I love the chorus lines and the counter melody in there. Fantastic song that's much needed on this album. The other one that's a little bit different, other than the interludes, is Naked Sunday, which is this very funky song that feels weirdly like a song from the 80s, a song a little bit more advanced for the time, yet somehow feels like nowadays it feels like a perfect 90s song. It's very funky and very weird at times. I love the bass line on here. It's so rhythmic and so interesting. And this is one of the songs that Scott Weiland uses a little bit of weird distortion on his voice that kind of just fits really well with this song and makes it a standout song on here. Scott Weiland also uses some distortion on Piece of Pie, where he uses a little bit more of a nasally voice. Not one of my favorite things to hear from him, but still a really interesting idea on here that he doesn't really use later in the other albums. Also, he does use a megaphone idea on songs like Cracker Man and on Dead and Bloated, which again gives a nice little touch on some of these songs that do feel a little bit similar. The other two songs on here are No Memory, which I've touched upon, that feels a little bit like a Metallica song, and Wet My Bed, which feels so weird and so off-putting compared to everything else on this album, yet for some reason it's so fascinating in its weirdness. It's my least favorite song on the album, but it's no way in any shape a bad song. It just feels kind of out of place on this album. This album does talk a lot about sin, whether it's about Wicked Garden, which is talking about stripping away all sin so that you can be a little bit more pure, or if it's Naked Sunday, which kind of talks about the ironies and the hypocrisies of religion in a tongue-in-cheek way. You also have the idea of the effects of sin hurting other people, where it's, you know, either dead and bloated, where it's talking about being lethargic and apathetic about life because this person has such a cynical outlook to the point where they literally sit around being dead and bloated. Or if it's sin, which is talking about the idea of alcohol abuse. If it's Piece of Pie, talking about someone who kind of just has been broken by the weight of sin in the world. Or if it's Creep, again, another one feeling about being depressed and worthless in all aspects of life. All of these songs, for the most part, have the touches on either the ideas of religion, the ideas of sin, or the effect of other sins, or, you know, just judging world in general. There is one particular song that's a little bit hard to talk about even today, especially today, and that one is Sex Type Thing. The idea of this particular song, it's about a man who wants to rape a woman. There's no sugarcoating that. There's nothing. The idea of where this song came from was from a girl that at one time Weiland was dating, who was raped by 3 high school football players. And the idea of what this song is, it's supposed to be a tongue-in-cheek nature or a satirical nature of what a man who's a macho man who believes that they can have everything, and the ideas of what this person is spreading. And it's very hard to talk about in all. It's a very depraved song, even in style, and I believe that's what they were going for. It is one of the more popular songs, but at the same time I understand that some people are not so keen on it, and as I'll talk about later, reviewers weren't necessarily keen on it as well. But all in all, a very interesting album with a lot of very interesting ideas that, kind of like the idea of grunge, are a lot of very artistic lyrics and very metaphorical lyrics rather than just in your face. Like, for example, if we go to Plush, it's a song about an obsessive relationship, but it's also about a girl who was kidnapped and killed. And just the blurring of those two ideas is very interesting. Even though Plush is an amazing song and a staple of the 90s and of grunge music, those lyrics are very all over the place. And that is what a lot of this album has. It has a lot of very visual, a lot of imaginative lyrics, which is another staple of why I love grunge so much. I will say the one big fault of this album, if I had to give it, is that there are a lot of songs that do feel very similar in style. The diversity is not nearly enough, and you know, even though there are songs that do bridge out the ideas, a lot of these songs are stacked together where they are very similar in style. For example, you do have Sex Type Thing, which is number 2 song. You do have No Memory, which is number 4. You have Naked Sunday, which is number 6. Creep, number 7. But like, other than that, Piece of Pie and Plush are next to each other. And a lot of those songs that are very similar are at the beginning of the album. Again, none of them are necessarily bad, and everyone has at least a little bit of difference, but I can see that can become a little bit draining, especially when a lot of those songs at the beginning are 5-ish minutes long. The CD, I believe, is the longest of Stone Temple Pilots, and it is about 50 minutes long. So if you take out Sin, and if you take out Let the Bed, that's about 47 minutes for 10 songs, which you're averaging about 4.5 minutes. And I can understand why that can be a problem when you have A Piece of Pie, when you have Sin, when you have Dead and Bloated, all tracking about 4.5 to 5 minutes long, and then you have Where the River Goes, the last song of the album, being over 8 minutes and not really feeling much different. However, I love this CD a lot. It is one of my favorite CDs. One of the albums by Stone Temple Pilots, which are easily in the top 25 of my favorite CDs of all time. I will say though, after listening to it again, I can't necessarily put it in my top 3 like I usually do with the likes of Super Unknown by Soundgarden and 4 by Blues Traveler. I think now the diversity is lacking in this, and as much as I love a lot of these songs on these albums, and especially a lot of the singles, it's really hard for me to be like, yeah, this is a perfect album. A lot of people do see it that way as well. Basically, with this album, it was very mixed. And the idea of a lot of listeners love this CD, but a lot of critics panned it. For example, in a pretty scorching review, Deborah Frost wrote that Stone Temple Pilots' hit Sex Type Thing could be used as a Mike Tyson's rape defense transcribed into grunge rock. It's unclear whether STP, which sounds like it had crash landed Pearl Jam into Alice in Chains, is condemning or identifying with its narrator. With a real point of view, this band could be bigger than an accident. Basically, what a lot of the criticisms boiled down to was that at the time, this band didn't sound much different from the likes of Alice in Chains, like Pearl Jam, like Soundgarden. And again, Sex Type Thing, because of its ambiguity, it was hard to know how to take that song. And it's still very hard to know how to actually take that song in today, even with the context given. But a lot of people did love this album as well. This album peaked at #1 on the Billboard's Hot Seekers chart and #3 on the Billboard 200. Sex Type Thing peaked at #23 on the Billboard US Main Rock chart. Plush peaked at #1 on the Billboard US Main Rock chart, 9 on the Billboard US Alt chart, #18 on the Billboard US Air chart, and #39 on the Billboard US Pop chart. Wicked Garden peaked at #11 on the US Main Rock chart and #21 on the US Alt chart. And Creep peaked at #2 on the US Main Rock chart, #12 on the US Alt chart, and #59 on the US Air chart. And what I think is one of the more interesting things is that in 1994, the band was simultaneously voted the best new band by Rolling Stone readers, but also the worst new band by magazine's music critics. Which, again, this is really interesting because this particular album, even though it was dropped in 1992, didn't get much work until 93. One of those big reasons being the acoustic version of Plush that was played on MTV show's Headbangers Ball in 1993, which is one of the quintessential unplugged songs that came from the 90s. When you think of like the MTV Unplugged with like Alice in Chains or Nirvana, you also think this particular version. You've probably seen it as a version where if you watch the video, it's, I believe, Scott Weiland's in a rocking chair, and it's very stripped down in sound. And I think that was one of the big reasons, and also Plush being such a popular song, that this album got the notoriety that it did later on. Plush won the 1994 Grammy Award for Best Hard Rock Performance, and Stone Temple Pilots also won the MTV Music Award for Best New Artist in the 1993 MTV Music Video Awards. The album ranked number 983 in all-time top 1,000 albums in the 3rd edition of that book in 2000. The album was also certified 8 times platinum by the RIAA on December 18th, 2001, making it the band's best-selling album. I also find that weird that I can't find any more updated stuff on it. You would think that over the years, especially with things that happened to this band, that this CD has gotten even more certified, but nothing, not even on RIAA. If you know how to find a more concise number of albums that have been sold, I would love to know, because I would love to see just how much has changed over the last almost 2 decades. Now, I love this CD. This is a fantastic beginning album, though there are some flaws that you can definitely see. if you have not listened to it and want to get into the grunge sound or even want to get into the Stone Temple Pilots, this is a perfect jumping on point, because then you can see how this band has changed over the years. Just know that this isn't the only sound that this band has, and we'll definitely be talking about that later on. But if you haven't listened to this band, I would say go for the 25th anniversary edition, because that has also unreleased demos, B-sides, and parts of 3 live performances from 1993, which are the Cassick Lake Natural Amphitheater performance, the Reading Festival performance, and the MTV Unplugged performance. So you get a lot of content, about like 50 songs, and I think it's really awesome. But I've speaked way too much on this. I hope you enjoyed. Very soon we're going to be talking about the next part and just how this band can top or maybe not top core. But in order for you to see that, you have to do a couple of things. First off, subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I make a lot of videos like these, or Are You Ins, or 5-minute theories. Every single week I try to make 3 videos every single week, and if you haven't subscribed, that is the most important thing that you can do, just so that I know that you appreciate my work and want to see more of it. Like this video if you like this album. Let me know what you love or hate about this album, or your favorite memories of this particular album. Share this with your friends if you think that they would find this interesting, and also just keep on watching my videos. So I'm going to try to put out one of these every Friday, which means in a couple of days we're going to be back with the second part of the Digging Through Discographies with Stone Temple Pilots, which will be looking at their second album, Purple. Until then, this is the Music Fan, and I am signing off.